All good? Hello. Welcome to PHP Sussex. My name is Yannick, and if this is your first time at PHP Sussex, we are a small Brighton-based user group dedicated to PHP and to web development in general. We gather once a month, usually on the second Wednesday of the month. In a minute, we'll be joined by tonight's speaker. His name is Christopher Miller. He's a full-stack engineer at Jump24. And he's no stranger to PHP Sussex because he actually gave a talk a couple of years ago already about PHP 8. And tonight he's going to show us some strategies to make our code clean, concise, and collaborative. I'm very much looking forward to that. But before I hand it over to Chris, Grace is going to tell us a few words about Silicon Brighton, who facilitates this meetup as well as many others in the area.
Hiya, thank you. I know a few of you, but for those who don't, I'm Grace and I run Silicon Brighton. We're a community initiative and our whole mission is around supporting and enabling digital growth in the area in the southeast. So this is one of many meetups actually. There's about sort of 20 or so altogether that we support all across the tech community. And they're all for people either in the industry or looking to get in the industry, or if you are a particular sort of coder or web developer, but you're looking just to build your skills or get a bit of knowledge in a different space, then you're more than welcome to come to the other events that we run as well. They are all free. The idea is to make them as accessible and as inclusive as possible. And we are run by a membership base. So we have a number of businesses who fund what we do to continue to make it free for the community. I can't remember what my slides say. So Charlie, maybe try the next slide if that's okay. So that's a list of all our members. So yeah, lots of businesses on there, and just a big thank you to them for funding and supporting and investing in what we do. And then this is basically a shout out for help actually. So with all of the meetups that we run, they are run by the community for the community. So it's a big thank you to the organisers and the helpers, the speakers and ambassadors that we already have, but we're always looking for more people and more ideas as well. With specific reference to this group, and then also Brighton Gophers. So if you know of any Golang people, or if you're a Golang person or coder yourself, then get in touch directly with me. Or if you have ideas for another meetup or another speaking opportunity, or if you want to do something yourself, we're really up for other people getting involved. And then this is some more details to tell us about tonight's speaker. So I'll pass you back to Yannick.
Thank you. Is Chris online?
I am.
Hey, Chris, how are you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thank you. So yeah, like I said earlier, you're no stranger to PHP Sussex because you already gave a talk, a couple of years ago about PHP 8, so kind of like covering the new features of PHP 8. And I'm curious actually because we've had a couple of minor releases since then, like PHP 8.1 and 8.2. And even though there are minor releases, they did come with a bunch of new features, some interesting ones. And I was wondering if among those, there are any that really stand out for you, some that you find more interesting than others.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ones that I actually use a lot is read-only classes. That's in 8.2. Gives you the ability to have an object that you can't change, which is fantastic when you're passing data around that you definitely don't want to change. Another one that I'm regularly using is the property promotion. So in a constructor, most of the time, the constructor body now has nothing in it. I think that was actually 8.0. but in 8.1, they also gave you the ability to define read-only on properties. So you could have a class that wasn't read-only, but you could have properties that were. The read-only class is a shortcut to saying read-only on all of them. Another one that I really, really like is the union types that can be used for returns. So you can, and for variables. So you can say this is a user and an authenticated user. That is absolutely brilliant because it means you can identify exactly what type of thing you're passing in if you've got multiple classes that are inheriting.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was thinking about it, the first that came to mind was the read-only attributes and property in classes as well. Yeah, I really like the way we can we get more control about like the immutability of our classes, and I think that's definitely like a step towards the right direction for PHP. I haven't been using the union types that much actually. Yeah, so I should probably look into that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean union types. If you don't need them, don't use them. But if you know that you only want one subtype of a class to be passed into something, it can prevent you from passing the wrong version in. Combine that with PHP stan and with linting, and you can end up with some absolutely brilliant results that are very, very close to completely strongly typed. The only thing we're missing is actually variables. When we can strongly type internal variables in functions, I think we're fully there. And there's a few packages out there, one of which I actually wrote this weekend.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, then, without further ado, I'm going to let you get on with your talk whenever you're ready.
I'm ready when you are. So let me just switch screens and so yes, as Yannick said, this is a talk about clean, concise, collaborative code. At this point, I would normally ask the room a question, but as I'm not there, I can't. The question I'd normally ask is, what does clean mean to you? So for me, clean is about code that anybody can read. Concise, that's about making the code as simple as you can. Collaborative, that's about code that everybody can get involved with and everybody can work together on. So that's what we're going to look at today. The idea of writing code that anybody can read, code that's simple and easy to understand, and then code that anybody can work on. So who am I? I'm a full stack developer, public speaker, developer relations and open source, and a clean code fanatic. Jump24 are a full circle development studio delivering bespoke software to both the industry and end customers. And we're Laravel partners. So we are one of the leading Laravel developers across the world. We're going to look at 6 questions about your code. Question 1 is your plan extensive enough to help someone else? Question 2, is your code abstracted enough to minimize load? Question 3, is your code encapsulated enough to be clear? Question 4, is your code tested enough to allow you to be confident? Question 5, is your code documented enough to help? And then question 6, is your code clear enough that a non-developer can understand it? We're going to look more at that right at the very end. Because for me, if a non-developer can understand it, then anybody can. So let's go straight in at the start, which is your plan extensive enough to help someone else? Now, I've been through times where I wouldn't plan at all. I've been through times where I plan every single line of the code. I've been through times where the plans have been absolutely terrible for both reasons. Because what if I'm not there the day that somebody else needs to pick it up? So what would we want to plan? Well, is every step along the path clear enough? Does it have something that tells you what the next step is with that code? Now, this might be at a smaller level, like a single class or a single function. But you can also do this at the wider level, so a full feature that you might be asked to implement for a customer or in an app. But it's important that every step is planned. Now, does that mean that I'm going to write a 50-page document that tells you how to write a function? No. Does it mean that I'm going to write a 100-page document that tells you every single thing in the process of the entire app? No. What it will do is give you a clear enough outline of where we're going and then define some of the parameters that we need to think about. So, can someone else understand and execute your plan is kind of the key question that we need to ask. And I've had times where I've looked at my own plans very much like that picture, and I have no idea what I'm talking about in my own plan, and that can be the same day. I've also had times where I've looked at a plan and thought, I'm missing something. So why don't we have a look at a really simple plan that we might want to write? Our mission for this, let's make a simple calculator. It's only going to handle integers. So whole numbers go in, whole numbers come out. Well, we might think about this and we might go, well, we don't need a plan for this. But actually, I would say we do. Because our plan is that only integers go in and only integers come out. When we start writing this, we might have something that defines what the class is called. We'll define our methods. So here we're calling the class calculator, and we're having our 4 methods: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. We know that they're all going to receive 2 integers. And add is unsurprisingly going to add them together. Subtract is going to minus the second param from the first. Multiply is going to multiply the first param by the second. And divide is going to divide the first param by the second. Now, we're absolutely fine with our integer plan here for add, subtract, and multiply. You can't get a decimal point from either of those. But 1 divided by 2, well, now we've got a problem because our plan was that we were going to handle integers. But what we've discovered by breaking this down is that we have to change our initial thought because now we've got to handle a float. We've got to think about decimal points because it's a valid result from our inputs. Now, this is obviously a really simple, almost oversimplified example, and normally we'd be looking at more complex features. But even in this really simple example, we can see that just taking the time to think about that and to put it down on paper can highlight where we have problems in our initial thoughts of what we're going to do. So once we've done that, well, what might an implementation look like? So you'd follow the plan step by step. If that plan doesn't answer something when you get to it, discuss it with your team. If you can see a better way of getting to the same thing, discuss it with your team. If you can see potential bugs, discuss it with your team. Basically, the key takeaway is talk to your team, because the team that you have around you are the people that are going to be able to help you to implement your plan to the best of your ability. And those conversations with the team before you start the implementation process can actually save much more time at the end of the process when you get to code review. So imagine a code review where you put in your functionality, and we've gone with our add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and we've gone, yeah, we've said it's an integer. Well, I'd be having a conversation with the team around the divide function, because there's that element there where we've got to change our original plan. For us, this might mean we need to go and talk to our customer, and we might need to explain to our customer that their criteria don't quite meet what we want. So can we change this? Is this something that the system can handle? Do we need to look at another way of doing it? Can I see a better way of doing this? Well, yeah, because at the moment, we're going to have a class where you do one functionality, and then get a result, and then do a second functionality and then get a result, and then do a third functionality and get a result. So we're going to be doing lots of individual lines where we're calling them all together. Or we can have the system return an instance of itself and store that in a variable a property within the class. So we could have a system that starts at 0, and we can say add and take in a single integer. We can say subtract and take in a single integer. And then once we've done all of our maths, we can get to the end of it and we can have an equals function. So we can now chain our methods together, and that in itself becomes easier to read. So that's where I'd be discussing with the team. Maybe there's a better option here. Potential bugs. I'd be looking to talk to the team about what if we have a floating point that isn't exactly like we think it's going to be. So slightly different to our original plan. Let's say we were taking in floating points as well, and we took in 0.1 and 0.2, and we added those together. Well, it's not 0.3. In PHP, we can actually inherit floating point errors. So it could be 0.3, lots of zeros, and a 4 at the end. So our number might not be exactly what we want. So I'd be discussing that potential bug that I can see now before I started writing the code. Those conversations can actually eliminate bugs, can eliminate a lot of the changes that you'll have to do at the end of the process by moving that conversation to the front of the process. So planning for me is essential, but it's key that the plans are useful to the people that are going to need it. So if I'm dealing with a developer who's very experienced on the application and knows exactly what the application does at any given moment and knows the code base well, well, then I probably don't need to go as deep and involved in the plan as I would for somebody who's brand new to the project and who doesn't know the application as well. So I might, in my plan, describe using a service. And then in that plan, the service is already written. So we might look at how to use that service and what variables that expects to take in and what it expects to return. Now, yes, our code can tell us that, but by putting it in the plan, we can have those conversations earlier as well. So we can potentially avoid some pitfalls for developers that don't know the app. What if we've got a service that doesn't quite do what people think it's going to do? Well, then that's another conversation that you'd be having earlier because that service has been discussed in your plan. So our second question, is your code abstracted enough to minimize load? So what we're talking about here is mental load and the amount of information that you hold at any one time. So we can go way over abstracted and we can have a single function in a single file and we can do that over 1,000 files. And yeah, that's actually a form of abstraction and it does work. But for me, that's too complicated because you're having to remember multiple files. We can go way too far the other way and we can have one massive great file that's 5,000 lines long that does everything. For me, that's just as much of a problem as having too many different little abstractions. You kind of want to sit somewhere in the middle. So what is abstraction? For me, the easiest definition is abstraction only shows what is needed at the time and hides what isn't needed right now. So if I've got a method on a user that says, have I got a session? And we call that active session or has active session. Do I need to know the ins and outs of how that checks whether we've got an active session or not at the time I'm using it? Probably not. So it makes sense for that to be away from the implementation and in the user, and possibly even in a trait, because we're not going to use it all the time. But by the same token, we may want to have access to other things at that point. So we may want to be able to get that session from the user. So we might have a user and get session. So now we can actually get the session and we can see what's there. That for me is where the key comes in of what are you going to need now. So another example would be using our users. What about a user that you pass to the front end? You're never, ever going to want to pass a password to the front end of the system, hashed or not. So I've never found a need for a password to be on the front end. So I'll actually have a class that will abstract the password out of the way and ensure that my user that I pass to the front end can never have the password available. I'll also have an authenticated user and unauthenticated user class. These are just identifiers that are attached to the user at different points. But by doing that, it makes it clear to me which type of user I'm using at the time. So as we were just discussing at the start, this is where those joined types, so doing user and authenticated user, well, if we're in a section where we need to be authenticated, it's an immediate safeguard that we have an authenticated user at this point. So, little meme. Did you use every abstraction possible? Yes. And what did it cost? Everything. That's exactly what I was just talking about. That's this idea of abstracting everything to the nth degree and having everything pulled apart to the smallest possible components just in case we need it. It can actually end up creating problems, and it can end up that you are in abstraction hell trying to work out where that thing is. But we can also have this with too many dependencies. So you can over abstract to the point that you're trying to explain a gigantic tree of dependencies. So your user can be an authenticated user, and it can be a user without a password, and it can be a user who does have a role, and it can be a user who doesn't have a role, and it can be a user who doesn't have, and a user who does have. Sometimes we might just want to simplify that, and we might want to think about the use case for our app. So does it make sense in your app to identify by class a user that doesn't have a role? Not always. Sometimes that can just be a method on the user. So think about how many dependencies you're going to create and how much information you're going to create that people need to understand. But conversely, this can be what happens when you're copy and paste coding. So there's times where I've gone, there's no need to abstract this. I only need it in one other place. Let's copy and paste. 12 months down the line, I'm using it in 10 places. Well, maybe I should have abstracted it. So again, it comes back to that conversation with your team. Hey, I think we might need to use this somewhere else in the future because we've got these things that we're looking at developing in the future. Do you think we should abstract that? Do you think it should be a method? That conversation flow going through the whole system and through the whole project is what keeps everything in line to the point that people can be comfortable with the code base. Does that mean that the code base is always going to be easy to understand and always going to be perfect? No, because we're human. We don't do perfect. We do imperfect. But if we're copying something more than, say, 2 times, maybe we should be thinking about an abstraction, and that's not always the right answer. So the next question is your code encapsulated enough to be clear? So encapsulation is kind of very, very similar to abstraction. So this is making sure that everything is together in one place that you need it to be. So you'll have your class, you'll have your methods, you'll have your variables, and all of that bound together is the definition of encapsulation for me. Now, there are more complicated ways of explaining this, but in principle, it's about what should be there and what shouldn't be there. So what should be encapsulated? All data should be in a single class that's relevant. All methods should be in that class. All related classes should be easily identifiable. And all unrelated classes should be easily distinguishable. No data should be accessible that is not needed. And no data should be inaccessible that is needed. So there's lots of this and not this in these points. But in essence, it's thinking through, what do we need now? And do we need it in this class, or should it be a new class? Now, I use class as an example, but this could be in functional programming as well. We could be looking at functions that return an object or return an array. And we might not want certain things in that array, and we might want certain things in that array. So it's about identifying what do we need and putting it together, identifying what we don't need and ensuring it's not there. So obviously this comes with its own issues. So I had a problem, so I thought I'd use OOP. Now I have a problem factory. In OOP, we have a name for everything. We have factories, we have mocks, we have generators, we have builders. All of these things are ways of getting to the data and controlling the flow of that data. But sometimes it can be over the top. So the scenario of having an issue in code and separating it up and creating a factory that generates something for you, and the same issue existing, you can have just wasted 3 hours of your time building that factory and separating it out and getting your tests in place to find out that you've actually not achieved anything because the problem was in the data in the first place. And similarly, we have this idea of, we think that an animal can be human if it has 2 legs, a pet if it has 4, it can be a dog if it has 8 fleas, and a cat if it has 4 fleas. That in itself is a really simplified model, and what usually happens is more like what's on the right. So we have multiple lines linking everything together and it becoming really, really complicated. But actually, we could probably take that and we could probably relay that whole mess out and make it clearer what's happening. We can make it clearer how these things interact together and make it much nicer to understand what's happening if we think about that plan, that abstraction, and that encapsulation. So, question 4. This is the one that is probably the most controversial. Is your code tested enough to be confident? Now, I personally love tests. There was a time where I hated them because it felt like I was just writing code for the sake of it. But now I understand the value of the pyramid of tests. So at the bottom, we have unit tests, which are our smallest little chunks of code that we test. And that's where we'll put quite a lot of our time into ensuring that these units work individually. Then we'll have our integration tests layered on top of that. So our integration tests are putting some of those tiny little building blocks together. And do they work in the same way as we think they do together? Then we'll have our end-to-end tests, which for us is UI testing. And this is about ensuring that it meets the requirements that you have for the front end. So can you see what you think you should see? Can you not see what you think you shouldn't see? Then we've got this little thought bubble, which is kind of like an afterthought, which is manual tests. Now, manual tests do have their value, but they're not the be-all and end-all of testing, and neither is any one of these on their own. Manual tests are designed to ensure that your app meets the customer's requirements. So manual tests often for us are, we finished this feature, please go and test it, Mr. Customer. They'll go through and they'll test the app and they'll say, yes, this is functioning as we wanted, or no, it's not, we actually want this change. So then we go back to that conversation with the team, and that includes the customer. Well, actually, our end-to-end tests show this, our integration tests show this, our unit tests show this, and our original plan showed this. So we've now got this hierarchy of things that we can build on to identify and show that we've achieved what we set out to achieve. So all of these are important. So you're telling me that I have to write code to check if the code I wrote earlier was right? Well, yeah, because actually these tests are our contract. And for me, I'll write those tests first. So my tests come before the code, and it will usually be taken from the user stories in the first place. And those tests can go from red to green or from failing to passing. And over time, we can see that we've achieved what we set out to achieve. If we get to a point where one of our unit tests can't be passing because of the way that the code is written, or can't be passing because there's a requirement that's causing an issue, well, then that's a point at which we can go back and talk to our customer. We can go and have that conversation and say, look, we've got two conflicting things here. We're asking it to do this, and both can't happen at the same time. How do we want that to happen? And this is what happens when you do unit testing on its own, but no integration tests. Both those drawers work. Brilliant. What if you want something from both drawers at the same time? Well, now we've got a problem because you can't open them both at the same time. Now, that's a really silly example because that's just bad design. But you can have this in code. You can have units that conflict with how they change the data. So imagine a function going back to our calculator, and we accidentally have our subtract doing the add and the add doing the subtract. And then we integrate these with our integration test that joins them all together. And we go, yeah, our result isn't what we think. So now we can go back and we can look at our code and we can pick apart what's happening. If the code isn't at fault, we can go back a step further to our plan and we can break down our plan. If the plan isn't at fault, we can go back a step further to our customer's original requirements. And we can look through that. We can compare that with what we're seeing now. If we can see that every step along the way to the integration tests is right, then maybe we need to have a conversation about what were the original requirements compared to what's actually happening. Is it the requirements need to change? Is there a rule that's wrong here in our code? Is there a piece of logic that's not functioning as we expect? But these tiers build up to give us a brilliant case for going and holding conversations, which at the end of the day is the key thing that this entire talk is about. Holding those conversations, but this gives you the evidence and the simple code to make it easier to work with. So testing is absolutely brilliant, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Brennan Keller, when he shared this, has 22,000 retweets and 57,000 likes. He's now up to a heck of a lot more than that. So a QA engineer walks into a bar. He orders a beer, 0 beers, 999 billion beers, a lizard for some reason, -1 beers, whatever the heck that is. And the first real customer walks in and asks where the bathroom is, and the bar bursts into flames, killing everyone. Now, obviously, this is an exaggerated point, but the idea here is that having this testing process in place doesn't guarantee that everything else is right to that point. So your tests are only as good as the foundation they're built on. If you're building it on the foundation of make me a screen that is blue and has a button, well, that doesn't tell you a lot about your system. But if it's make me a screen that's blue, the button is centered to the screen, the button's going to have a label of a submit, that button's going to be green with a drop shadow behind it, it's going to have rounded corners. Well, now we've got a lot more information about what we want, and our tests can achieve that. Our original test would be load the page, can we see blue, can we see a button? Our new tests are going to be load the page, can we see blue, can we see a button, can we see the content of that button being right, Can we see that the button clicks and does the right thing? So this is where the build-up of these tests helps. But those tests on their own wouldn't be enough. What if we had all of that right, but actually we'd linked it to the wrong place? So we can see that we click it and something happens. But what if we'd linked it to the wrong place? So this is that idea of the customer walking in and asking where the bathroom is. Customers might expect something different. End users might expect something different. As developers, we often forget that things will function for us in ways that we don't expect, in ways that we expect them to, because we've written the logic. So we'll test to our logic, and that will be subconscious. So we won't actually think about how we're doing that. It just happens that because we wrote the logic that goes behind it, we expect it to act in that way. Whereas once we give it to a customer, they're expecting it to happen in the way that they designed it to be, or the way that they explained they wanted it to be. And sometimes words fail us. We don't actually know how to describe what we want. So once we've given them this, we might have that conversation again around the layout of things, or the wording of things, or the way that sums are happening, or the way that logic is breaking something down. The key thing again is conversations. So our tests are great, but getting it in front of customers, end users, and having that conversation is just as important. And I would also strongly suggest don't do that on production if you can help it, because you don't want to break a production service if you can help it. So, question 5. Is your code documented enough to be helpful? That's a book that I could have written. Excuses for not writing documentation. So this is documentation on how you get the project set up, how you use the project, and how you understand the code. So there's a balance here. On one side, you have documentation should tell you how to get set up and what the code does. But on the other side, it doesn't need to tell you line by line what each specific thing does, especially if it's self-explanatory. So by self-explanatory, I mean if your code is clear as to what's happening and your documentation tells you step by step how to get set up. So it might be that you need some parameters, some environment parameters that you need to go and fetch from a store that you have set up within your company, or you might need to download a Docker image, or you might need to connect to a specific database. Those sort of things should be there, and it should tell you what the code does. So it should tell you that if your app is a calculator, that it's a calculator that adds things together and goes through the steps of what it does. It doesn't need to tell you how it does it, because that's what the plan was for. Now, combining those two together, you actually have a full story of your app with the plan telling you what it does, the plan telling you how it does it, the documentation telling you what it does, and your tests telling you that it's doing it. So those all pieced together give you a flow that ends up with your code feeling more like something that people can use and that people can build to, and people can build on. So the final question is your code clear enough that a non-developer can understand it? Now, why the heck would I be suggesting a non-developer? Well, if a non-developer can understand what is happening, even if they don't understand how it's happening, then we've achieved what we need to achieve. So imagine the scenario that you need to explain to a customer some logic in code. It's going to be much easier to explain it with one style of code than it is with another. Just as an example, let's have two simple things here. And this is kind of combining that idea of abstraction and encapsulation. So if user session flag triple equals 1, authentication logout equals true. Else, if user find where username request data username and where password is request data hashed password, then authentication login. Or on the right, we've got the same concept in a way that anybody can understand what is happening. Do I need to know at this point that the logout is about setting a flag? No. Do I need to know that the login is about doing varying other things? No. Do I need to know that the validation of the user is based on the username and password at this point? Not really. So on the right, we've got if user has session, authentication logout. Else, authentication validate user login. To me, that tells a story, whereas the one on the left tells a much more complicated form of the same story. The end result would be identical, but the way that it reads is different. And I would rather give to a customer, a team member, what's on the right, so the user has session, than what's on the left, because it just reads easier. So think in terms of having as few nested layers of code as possible. I mean, we could even go one step further with the code on the right. We could actually return the authentication logout, and we could actually return the authentication validate user login. By doing that, we can actually take out the else. So it becomes really easy then to understand what's happening, because return, even to a non-developer, can be fairly simple to understand. It's sending it back somewhere. Do they need to know where it sends it back to? I mean, we could take the time to explain to them how the kernel and request lifecycle works, or we could just say it's returning back to the app. In this instance, we'd have the tests surrounding this, and we'd have our plans surrounding this, and we'd have our layers of abstraction and encapsulation around this. And we've got to a point where, with everything put together, a non-developer can understand how we've got there. And there's one final point, and you may have heard this before. If you were hit by a bus tomorrow, could anyone else pick up your work? Now, sometimes the answer is no. They can't. The aim is to get to a yes, somebody could pick up my work. Or as it's often called, reducing the bus factor. For me, if we can get to the point where that bus factor is 0, then we've achieved absolute perfection. So nobody is the center of controlling an app or controlling a project, because everybody has built up together. Now, is that always going to be possible? No. Is that ever going to be possible? Maybe. I've not found a project where that's worked fully yet, but there might be one out there somewhere that does work like that. But if we use what we've discussed here, we can build a project that is easy for everybody to understand and for everybody to work towards the end goal of the project being clean, concise, and collaborative. So Yannick, are you there?
I'm here. I was just captivated by what we're saying. Thank you very much. Super interesting. Are you happy to take some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to start then. You talked about documenting, and so there are like several forms of documentation. There's the code documentation, and you've got the documentation which is outside of the code. And I was wondering if you've got any strategies to make sure that this documentation doesn't get out of date, out of sync with the code, because that's usually an issue in a lot of companies. People write documentations, and then, it gets out of sync. So yeah, if you have any tips maybe for this kind of stuff not to happen.
Yeah, so again, it kind of sounds like I'm going to end up repeating myself, but that conversation with people and just saying to somebody, hey, I've just done this. Can you double check that we've got the documentation right here? Those conversations can be really key. Another element that works well is kind of having a release checklist. So if you're going to put something out into the main system and it's going to make its way to production, have the documentation as a check on there. And that can be as simple as, has the documentation file changed in the repo? Sometimes the answer is going to be no, because the feature you're releasing doesn't need it. But you can make that one where it's not a breaking block if you have that in your pipelines. But you can have it there as an indicator that just warns you that the documentation hasn't changed. Sometimes the answer is that's great, that's fine. But sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I didn't update that section, I needed to update. Inline documentation, most of the time we don't use inline comments because the return types help us to understand that. The naming conventions help us to understand that. Where we do have comments, it'll explain why a piece of logic is like it is, rather than exactly how we implemented it. So we might have a comment that says, because of an error in calculations elsewhere, we're taking 10 off this, or because the customer wants a percentage removed, we're taking 5% off here. Those sort of comments will be in there, and it will just reference the conversation and the ticket that's related to. But for DocBlocks, generally speaking, we don't actually use them that much. We tend to use smaller, more easily readable code that helps you to understand it. And with that plan documentation that over time builds up to be almost a handbook of exactly how the app works, you kind of don't need them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and also I guess that goes back to what you were saying about, is the code clear enough so like a non-technical person can understand it? If you get to that point, yeah, you don't need documentation, like inline documentation as much, I guess. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never actually got there. I've never got to the point that a non-developer can understand everything I write. I mean, I don't even understand it myself on a Monday sometimes.
Yeah, I guess that's something you try to tend to, but you can't really achieve, I guess. Cool. Does anyone, there's another question for you. Just a sec.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for that talk. It was really good. Thank you. Just on that planning stage, I guess I've got sort of two questions part of it. So in the planning, who do you normally involve in that planning stage? And then how do you actually plan for, changes that are ultimately going to happen when, later down the line, the client will change their mind, they'll see something, they'll need to change it. How do you build change into that plan in the first place?
So a lot of the time, the team involved will be the customer, the developer or developers that are working on that feature, and usually a third party, so somebody who's not directly involved, just as an extra sounding board to make sure that we're not going a million miles off the beaten path. In terms of building in the change, what we actually do is any change that is requested, it goes through a ticket. I mean, obviously, if somebody comes and says, can you change that to a capital S, then we don't need to go through a full ticket and estimation process. But if it's changing logic, then we'll make sure that that goes through the estimation process and through a ticket so that we've got a point to refer back to. We've had occasions where bugs have been raised to us by a customer, and because we have that path of being able to go back and say, actually, here's the documentation that was there, here's what planned. So what you're asking for isn't a bug, it's a feature change. we can usually do that. Another element that we often do is if something is going to change, we'll look at, okay, do we need to do this in the same place? Is this something that we need to be putting somewhere else? And it's again those conversations with everybody involved. And developers, I know that I absolutely hate being on Zoom calls because they get really annoying, but they're also really useful if they're the right type of conversations that you're having. I mean, I've had Zoom calls that could have been a meeting, and I've had emails that, Zoom calls that could have been an email, and I've had emails that should have been a Zoom call. But those kind of ad hoc conversations on the go are what makes sure that we're getting the change that's in place. So we'll also ask, so we're putting this in now. Is there something you're planning to change with this in the future? Is this a phased approach? Are you looking to add more to this in the future? And we'll often ask for an outline of the overall plan for a feature if it is something that's going to be phased, because we might want to do something differently. So, for example, let's say that you've got a phased approach of an integration for an API. Step one is to collect the data so that one of their teams can assess what they're going to do with it. And step two is to put that data into the system. Well, if they don't tell us that there's a step two and it's just collect data, then it could be a quick and dirty run the API call, chuck it in the database and not worry about it. But because we know they want to do something with that data, then we'll take the time to build a class for the response that allows us to build off that in the future and to abstract the data that we want to show on the front end later. Do I need to know what that data is that we want to show on the front end now? No. But by knowing that that's coming, we can change how we approach it. Does the customer always know what they want? No. Does the customer always know what they want at the end of the feature? No. But having those conversations, sometimes they've got a vague idea, and that vague idea can be enough of a clue that there's a change coming.
Thank you. Sorry, I've just got one sort of, it's not really follow-up, it's a separate question actually. So a lot of the points you spoke about, sort of concise collaboration and especially the testings, the automation testing, they always sort of, focus on, is your code, doing X, Y, Z, doing as it should. But a lot of the time they don't ever put any emphasis on like non-functional requirements, such as, the performance that something should do. So how do you build that into, I guess, starting from the beginning to the end, how do you build in something like that into that?
So one of the things that I particularly do is using Laravel, we're able to use the debug bar that gives us a heck of a lot of information. That gives us how many queries are happening, how long queries are taking for database optimization. I'll look at what's actually going on in the front end. So I'll look at the debug tools there. And in the process, we'll look to aim for a fixed figure for that particular feature of what we expect it to achieve. Now, do we always get there? No, we don't. Sometimes we'll say, well, we want this page to load in 0.1 seconds. It's very rare that we get exactly 0.1. We might get 0.15. Well, I'd say that's pretty close. Whereas if we're going, well, we think this should load in 0.1 and we're looking at 2 seconds, then there's probably something going on that shouldn't be. In other areas, Spotlight is absolutely fantastic for the end result of, does the app perform as you'd expect it to for an end user in terms of performance, accessibility, and all the rest of it. Internally, I'd be looking at things like PHP Stan, ECS, Enlighten, that will help to strengthen what your code is doing. And it will also make some suggestions when it's set up the right way that will improve optimization. The other thing that often happens, again, it's that conversation. I'll suggest, hey, I'm looking at this query and I think we can do better, but I can't quite see how. That conversation can often result in somebody else saying, well, actually, if you change that order there, and you do that there, well, now you've got a faster query. We've also had occasions where there's been massive improvements put in on performance just by adding something so simple as indexes. So thinking about where your app is going to be using stuff, caching it, indexing it, it's all part of the planning process. And I'd love to have spoken on this for days. There's so much that we do that works into this whole process of, does this work as we expect it to? Caching is one of the most useful that we've found. And caching in the right way really makes a massive difference. On one app, there was a query that was running roughly 1,000 times a minute, and the results weren't changing for 2 or 3 hours. So we cached the result for an hour. And just by doing that, the performance increased on the app. Another one where a stored procedure was running and it was collecting 5 or 6 different things. And this stored procedure was collecting them all together. And then at the front end, we were filtering it and saying, actually, we only wanted that one. Or we broke that into 5 parts and now that performs more optimized. Sometimes the optimizations can be staring you in the face and you don't think about them until there's a problem.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks. Anyone else? Are there any questions online? Nope.
Do you have any recommendations for tooling to look at for integration testing?
Yeah. So in PHP, integration testing for us is done in PHP unit. So we will write the integration tests in PHP unit with Laravel's help functions. You could also be looking at PEST as well, which is another great testing framework. Integration tests for us are about the next step up, whereas what I think you're getting at is almost that step between integration and end-to-end. So integration would be, is this service functioning as I'd expect? End-to-end would be, does it look right? I think what you might be trying to get at is controllers, and does this all function as we expect together?
I guess more just what's the level up from your unit testing. Where you're looking at, do functions in a service like operate correctly together when you start bonding them together?
Yeah, so we'll actually do that in PHP unit or PEST. You can use any of the testing frameworks for that. Because you're controlling what goes in and out better and thinking about what goes in and out better, it's very rare that you'll need to override anything on the service that needs to be done in any magic way. You just pass it in. Our service providers will create the service for the app with the client as we'd expect. And in the test, we might mock the client so that we get some results that we expect to get. But we're just passing that into a new service. And because we identify the tests in as small a block as possible to test what we're looking at, then we're actually controlling what we need to worry about. An example, recently I was working on a service that took in, I think it was 15 parameters. But it turned out that for what we needed, it didn't need to take in those 15 parameters. And throughout the app, 12 of them were almost always the same thing. So what we actually did was took those out as optional parameters and had defaults. And just by doing that, by having the defaults and using name parameters, we could shrink down what we needed to think about mocking. Again, it's those conversations that really help to plan that out. One thing that I've really been looking at the moment is the idea of using something like Cucumber or Behat for integration testing. We've not got to the point that we've implemented it yet, but I can see how it's going to be useful if we do. There's a lot of developers out there that use it, and it does work really well for them. We just haven't yet worked out how to fit it into our flow.
That's great. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, just to react to that, talking about code which is understandable by non-technical people, stuff like Gherkin and Bhat is definitely along those lines, I guess. Anyone else? Don't think so. But one last question for you, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because so you've been talking a lot about conversations. That's really like the point you're getting across. When people are working remotely, some people at the office, some people remotely, how do you make those conversations happen? Do you use like Slack or something? You just like ask a question in one of the channels, or have you? Yeah, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so for us, we use Slack as our central communication system. We are pretty much fully remote. We do have an office, but there's about 3 of us that use it occasionally. Where we work is there's a channel for each project. There's then an overall tech help channel, or tech questions as we call it. So if your question is just, how do I do this? Then you could put it in tech questions. If your question is more specific to the app, then you'd put it in the channel. And if it's one of those where you literally need a face-to-face because you need to show somebody, then we've actually attached, believe it or not, Google Meets to the top of every channel. And it's as easy as, if anybody on the project's free to jump into the meet, could you drop in? And usually you'll get a yes. And those quick 10-minute conversations, for us, we kind of use Slack like we would tapping on somebody's shoulder in the office and just go, hey, need a hand for a minute?
Yeah, sounds good. That's definitely good advice. All right. Well, if there is nothing else, I think we're going to stop here. Thank you very much again. Another round of applause for Chris. And yeah, hopefully see you in Brighton next time.
Yeah, I should be able to come down, hopefully for the next one, if we plan it far enough in advance.
No, we'll have a chat for sure. Cool. So I think before we wrap up, we have a few upcoming events.
Thank you. So yeah, these are our next events that are coming up, just to give you a flavour of some of the other meetups that we support. So we've got Sussex Game Makers, that's tomorrow night. It's just a social down at Loading Bar. So if you're into gaming, working gaming, want to meet some gamers or people in the games industry, then that is the meetup for you. And then we've got JavaScript Brighton next week. Also a social at the Walrus, that's on the 16th. And then the following week, Brighton Cloud, which is, I've completely forgotten the venue now, at MPB. There we go. Anthony's one of the organisers, so thank you. That's the QR code for our events calendar, but it is just on the website. On the homepage, you go to events or meetup groups, and that's the list of all the ones that we support that you can join, and then our events page as well. This is the save the date for the next PHP Sussex event, and you can join the meetup page. I expect you're all on it anyway, but if not, join as a member and then you get notified of all the events that are coming up. And then if you haven't already, we do have a Slack community. We launched it, I think, just before Christmas, and we've got about 2,500 people on there. So it's a really well, it's a big, growing, really cool community with people, again, at all different levels, with all different skill sets, on there for different reasons, whether you want to just chat to like-minded people, share challenges, share pics of your dogs, or soundtrack of the day, as well as some semi-work related stuff as well. It's all kind of happening on there. So please just sign up. It's, again, free. And yeah, you'll find your people on there. But that's it. We'll keep that one up. So if you want to scan it and join, then brilliant, or speak to one of us afterwards. about any of the stuff in which you can get involved, and we're here to help. And that's it.
Cheers. Cool. So yeah, I think we can wrap up. I think there is like some pizza left and some drinks. So if you guys want to hang out for a bit, and thank you to the people who joined online as well. And yeah, thanks to Pizza Pilgrims for having us, and thanks to Silicon Brighton for their support.